for hundreds of years. This simple piece of cloth, 14 feet long, worshipped by the faithful for centuries.
There's nobody else in history who's ever been described as being crucified like this. How can it not be?
For generations, people around the world have been perplexed by a linen relic that is said to contain the face of a crucified man.
A previous pope wrote the shroud was, quote, a truly mysterious image which no human artistry was capable of producing. Lair, but we have the book, the broadcast, and now the app.
While scientists called it a myth and believers called it proof, artificial intelligence later entered the debate. Instead of a stain or an image, it showed something strange, hidden geometry, codes that are repeated, a design that shouldn't have been in the fibers of the old linen. Was it something we weren't supposed to see? A miracle? Or an accident? What mysteries does the Shroud of Turin still conceal? The time-defying cloth, the Shroud of Turin, is not merely a relic. The narrative simply will not end. It is 14 feet long and little broader than 3 feet, with a herringbone weave that reflects light like a ripple on still water. On its surface is a faint image of a man, front and back, head to heels. It looks like a ghost was left behind after a body once rested there and then ran away without causing the fabric to wrinkle. The wounds are like a narrative engraved on the fabric, wrist markings lined up where nails would enter, a stain that appeared to be blood at the feet, an oval side that looks like a spear thrust. There are thin rings on the scalp that seem like a crown of thorns. It's not a shouting face. It floats, closing their eyes, beard split. It appears as though the picture and the material are separated because the hair falls in strands that seem to hover above the weave. The first documented show took place in a little French village in the 13th century, which later became a pilgrimage destination and a testing ground for skepticism. Crowds were present. Priests were involved in the procedure. Skeptics accused the church of putting on a show. The fabric went through a number of residences and hands before being taken to Turin by the House of Savoy. In 1578 began its long vigil, interrupted by smoke, fire, and rescue. Currently, it is housed in a climate-controlled case within the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, protected by steel and glass from time and certainty. Nothing altered its standing more than a photograph in 1898. Secondo Pia, a lawyer, set up his lamps and plates in a makeshift darkroom and worked in the dim light. When he developed the negative, he expected a mixture of tones. Rather, a strikingly transparent face looked back. The drawback seemed to be a plus. The faint image on the cloth became a striking portrait on film. The cheekbones were visible. Lips defined themselves. Hair was falling out in strands. There was an increase in the proportions and shape of the hands crossing across the pelvis. That reversal was not proof of anything, except that the image did not react with light in the same way as ordinary paint, but it changed the subject of conversation. The relic swung from devotion to trouble. The laboratory joined the chapel. The fabric underwent both invasive and patient procedures over the 20th century. Chemists employed chemicals to taste the fibers after they were peeled. Microscopes swept across the surface. Forensic investigators noticed that the blood-like spots discolored the threads rather than the image coloring the blood. Textile historians measured the twist of the yarn and compared it to looms in the Levant. Scientists investigating pollen discovered grains that resembled the vegetation of the Eastern Mediterranean. Each result seemed to tilt the conversation rather than put a stop to it. Questioning.
There was no portrait made of Jesus, so really the shroud still remains the best single thing that we have.
Nothing was conclusive enough to dissuade critics, little enough to appease believers. The shroud was still behaving normally. It was sufficient evidence that the next experiment was necessary. The image itself was as unruly as pigment, a binder layer, motions that sweep in any direction. There is no deep capillary penetration into the thread. The discoloration appears to rest on the crowns of the outermost fibrils, as if the sun had kissed it and left it alone. When depth maps created from intensity showed a correlation between image darkness and the theoretical distance from a body surface, it was an astonishing but measurable assertion. placing a towel closer to the nose and forehead and farther away from the cheeks should cause the blackness to alter with distance. The consequences of many attempts to reproduce that gradient by means of heat, vapor, or chemical processes were similar, but not exactly the same. The shroud stayed singular, which is a nice way of saying that it sat there while speculations came and went.
There's nobody else in history who's ever been described as being crucified like this. How can it not be?
The age-related analysis fire came next. In 1988, thread was removed from one corner of the material and sent to 3 labs. After assessing the amount of radiocarbon, they published a dating between the 13th and 14th centuries. For a lot of readers, that choice was unambiguous and final. A medieval origin explained the mystery in one statement. However, even in a straightforward statement, a clause may be hidden. A corner along an edge with known smoking, handling, and repair was the sample location. The part may contain later threads inserted during a medieval reweave, according to textile experts. Others voiced their displeasure of the cleaning process used on the sample. One region cannot speak for a diversified artifact that has suffered, some noted. The dispute continued. It was altered. The image is a superb example of medieval art, provided the period is accurate. If the date is off, the age is open. Reduction did not affect the fabric. In this sense, the shroud carried its conflict into the modern century. A picture that, before photography, worked like a negative, a surface effect without coloring, a depth-based connection that implies spatial data, a disagreement over age that may tell us more about sampling than origin, a situation that requires respect and rigor. In such chaos, a fresh voice emerged. It evoked neither unbelief nor belief. It brought about computing. The technique of learning from patterns that are too small for the eye to see and too large for the mind to comprehend was brought about by it. The machine was not enraged by the question. It was created to pose a more insightful query. What precisely is it that we haven't measured yet in this image? What would happen if a system designed to find order in chaos heard linen? What if chemistry mapped the threads and photography revealed the face? The divorce scandal. The most significant event in the shroud's recent history was the 1988 radiocarbon campaign, which provided finality. Zurich, Oxford, and Arizona. 3 laboratories, only one protocol. A piece of cloth taken from a corner and passed around the teams was cleaned, burned, turned into graphite, and numbered in accelerators that turn isotopes into years. The world was granted a clear window and was anticipating clarity between 1260 and 1390. Newspapers described the range as decisive. The voices of the museum relaxed. The story seemed to be over. The chosen corner has since developed into one of the most studied sections of any artifact globally. The lower left portion may have been restored after a fire that was documented in the 16th century and was handled by countless hands. Textile chemist Raymond Rogers argued that the corner fiber showed chemical differences from the main field, including residues associated with dyeing or repair and cotton combined with linen. If there was later content in that corner, the sample would be biased toward the present. Supporters of the test reply that laboratories checked the homogeneity and confirmed their cleanliness. Conversely, heterogeneous repair can be sufficiently large to alter the amount of radiocarbon while still withstanding a brief examination.
These segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there was no question about them.
The debate is in that fine balance between prudence and confidence. Rather than replacing radiocarbon, other methods entered the conversation to expand the viewpoint. Wide-angle X-ray scattering analysis of the cellulose order in ancient textiles has sometimes led to age estimates that are earlier than the medieval range. Critics caution that storage conditions, heat, and humidity may alter the signal, making calibration challenging and error bars broad. In response, proponents claim that each method has sensitivities and that convergence across methodologies is more significant than any one measurement. Pollen even enters through here. The mere fact that grains from Levantine species exist does not prove where they came from. It suggests movement or exposure. When paired with weave pattern studies and plant residues that some researchers have reported, it offers a partial picture that is consistent with antiquity without being confirmation of it. The most noteworthy aspect of this dispute is the method it activates. The shroud is not a laboratory sample. The relic is protected. The sampling is sparse and conservative, as required for preservation suggests that a single test usually concentrates on a small area. The physics of probability then adopts a brutal stance. A small amount of deception at the sample site might have influenced the results. A few threads come together to build a thesis. From a section along a seam, a century is formed. Taking more grid-based samples is a natural tendency in science. The custodial instinct is the instinct for protection. The conflict between such tendencies intensifies.
We have a picture, then that means everything about this picture should fit into what we know about forensics today.
The 1988 date is correct. The shroud is a magnificent medieval creation. The superficiality and the spatial mapping cannot be replicated by any known medieval technique. Thus, that does not explain how the image is created. If the date is wrong, the field reopens to a range that includes, but is not entirely definite of, the first centuries of the Common Period. That does not establish that the clothing was worn by Jesus. It only raises the question that is raised by scientific theories and tests. Like a referee who doesn't care about the result, artificial intelligence enters that restored question. No one touches the corner. It affects the data. It raises the question of what can be found without creating more problems. Never consider the possibility that artificial intelligence can date linen. No, it cannot. Structure can be distinguished from noise by analyzing the image at frequencies, resolutions, and transformations. It can determine whether variations in intensity correspond to the patterns that contact, projection, or another field effect would anticipate. By contrasting the interactions between the blood-like and image sections, it can ascertain whether order implies process. It is capable of analyzing both symmetry that is obvious to the unaided eye and symmetry that is only disclosed through a matrix. It is not a substitute for either for carbon counting or cellulose scattering. According to this companion, the question of how should not be put on hold by the disagreement over when. When an effect suggests that the case is not yet closed, but a procedure indicates that it is, the correct response is to remain neutral. Its objective is to develop a new test. The veil repeatedly mutters anomalies, begging for that examination. 3 developments in tomb algorithmic technology. High-resolution photos of the shroud, including multispectral sets that include UV fluorescence and infrared response, have been available for many years. More than quantity is changed when the images are sent into a system that has been trained to detect weak signals. It's pleasant. Principal component analysis separates variance from variance. Patterns are sought after by convolutional neural networks. Frequency filters highlight periodic behavior hidden within the weave. These techniques don't add information. They rearrange it in such a way that patterns outweigh randomness. When that rearrangement first came on the screen, some viewers expected confirmation of what their eyes already understood. A face, a chest, the hands, stains. Instead, the analysis yielded an unsettling conclusion. It showed an order that had nothing to do with a stamp, brush, or transfer. It looked like a rule that had never been written down. Before then, 3D simulations had been used to examine an earlier question. If a cloth had been draped over a human body, the image generated by contact would have left heavy markings where it contacted and light or no marks where it did not touch. Deformities are caused by this kind of contact map, especially along the shoulders, cheeks, and fingers. Some digital artists covered a model with a virtual cloth to produce theoretical sensations. The distortions in those examinations did not match the relatively undistorted proportions on the shroud. Imagining the fabric over a shallow relief rather than a full volume improved the fit. The conclusion was that the shroud did not rest atop a sculpture. It was that contact alone did not create what the linen holds. Something more like distance mapping appears to be a part of it. Here comes AI. whose eyes are not attracted to love. When the system examined pixel intensity as a proxy for image depth, it found a cross-sectional association. Darker signified closer in a tolerance range. Lighter meant farther. Even with extraordinary ability, if a picture were painted by hand, such a relationship would likely break down at minuscule scales. If pigment were transferred from a bas-relief by pressure, fibers would show directionality and penetration that would be inconsistent with the superficiality ascertained by microscopic surveys. The image on the shroud seems to show something that encoded spatial information without leaving bulk behind. These are cautious words for a cause. It was not claimed that the cloth was projected. Patterns on linen are not claimed to have been burned by radiation. When intelligent tools are asked what kind of order best explains the relationship between intensity and form, the only explanation is that the order more closely resembles a mathematical surface than a painting surface. In the fibril caps, the discoloration reaches down to microns. The hue shift has no effect on the core. The edges are delicate and unify over thread boundaries rather than clogging interstices. This uniform, superficial action on linen without scorching or diffusion has been difficult to replicate, even in laser trials conducted by different groups. The Shroud of Turin has stood at the intersection of mystery and history, faith and skepticism for centuries. Its fibers have been examined by science. The meaning of faith has been protected. Artificial intelligence has now discovered patterns that humans were never supposed to see, like depth without weight, impossible geometry, and hidden codes. Still, the fabric declines to provide a definitive response. Was it shaped by a body from antiquity? Made by medieval hands? Or touched by an unknown force? Every generation that dares to look more closely is silently challenged by the truth that is still ensnared in the fabric. The fact that the shroud remains rather than what it reveals may be its greatest secret.